Are you sure you want to be playing around with this thing?
It's just a book. No harm ever came from reading a book.
They could have at least wrapped her in those nice white bandages, like in the movies.
When I was in the 2nd grade, I checked out a book on ancient Egypt from my school library, and I have never been the same since. It had everything my little child heart could want. Cats, freaky funerary practices, and powerful witch goddesses Frankenstein and their husbands back to life. I kept going back to the library for more books. That was the first time I really sought out knowledge for myself. Plus, that period of my life really had an influence on the way I do my eyeliner. So when I say that I love ancient Egypt, I mean that I get pretty offended when movies aren't historically accurate. Which means that I'm in for a treat with these movies. Mummy movies just don't seem to work in today's day and age. The last high-budget mummy movie we got was that pile of hot garbage starring Tom Cruise that canceled the entire dark universe. But what is it about mummies that just hasn't managed to stick around? Well, today I'm answering that question for you and watching some terrible movies while doing it. Before we get started, don't forget to click that subscribe button so you can join me next time. I'm going to be breaking down some more mythical beasts and monsters, and the next video is going to be all about the Invisible Man. So if you're a fan of freaks like me, you're gonna want to see what's coming next. And now let's start at the beginning of the horror. Now, mummies have, by definition, sort of been around since the beginning of time. I'm using Wikipedia's rather extensive definition for this one, which is: a mummy is either a dead human or an animal whose soft tissues and organs have been preserved by either intentional or accidental exposure to chemicals, extreme cold, very low humidity, or lack of air, so that the recovered body does not decay further if kept in cool and dry conditions. Plenty of cultures mummified their dead and used plenty of different means, like the Sokushin Butsu, Buddhist monks in South Asia who intentionally mummified themselves alive. But the idea of a mummy's curse is almost exclusively an Egyptian idea, and a lot of that boils down to what the English were doing in Egypt around the turn of the century. Get ready for your history lesson, people. This one's a weird one. In 1882, the British occupied Egypt, and in the coming years made a few discoveries that really got people talking, like Cleopatra's Needle and the Rosetta Stone. All of a sudden, it became super popular for rich Europeans to decorate their homes with Egyptian mummies. People would gather for parties where they'd unwrap a mummy in public, and they'd even grind up real mummies just to ingest them as a form of medicine called mumia. It was really bad for our current historical understanding of ancient Egypt, of course. But it also inspired hundreds of stories about mummies between the years of 1860 and 1914. Pretty much every genre writer you can think of from the time dipped their toe in it, including the father of Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle. In his 1890 short story, The Rin of Thoth, a 3,500-year-old Egyptian priest named Sosra comes to life so he can be reunited with the mummified remains of his lost love. He intends to use a magic rin to bring her to life and passes as human for a while to get it. In the end, thieves attempt to separate the two mummies, and Sosra comes to life to kill them. Doyle sorta had a thing for the supernatural in general. He even wrote mummies into his 1892 short story, Lot Number 249. This story is about a medicine student who finds out that one of his peers has been bringing an Egyptian mummy to life just so that it can attack people he doesn't like. Simple, effective, I like it. But in the end, our hero forces our bad guy to burn all of his ancient Egyptian relics and promise never to do it again. So you can see that the story doesn't really show a whole lot of respect for the history of ancient Egypt. To understand this part, you need to know that Britain was under some pretty heavy economic threat from Europe and the Americas at the time. And so this fear of invading foreigners became something of a theme in writing at the time. Doyle wrote a story about how much of a threat outside cultures are to English purity. He may not have meant to target Egypt specifically, it's just sort of meant to stand in for any foreign country. And that's part of what makes Bram Stoker's mummy story so interesting. Best known as the guy who wrote Dracula, Stoker followed that up with his honestly much better novel in 1903, The Jewel of Seven Stars. I'm sorry, I don't like Dracula. I'm more of a Carmilla person. Dracula is several hundred pages worth of Mina whining that she needs a big strong man to save her, and Bram Stoker failing to deal with his gay feelings for Walt Whitman. And somehow that one became the more definitive vampire story than the one that came first and the one that has queer women in it. We're in the bad place, I know it, and if nothing else proves it, this does. Our main character works for an Egyptologist intent on bringing an Egyptian mummy back to life because her spirit has been haunting him in the form of a cat mummy. And she claims that ancient Egypt had access to technology far greater than anything found in the modern day. Our main character actually considers how important this discovery would be, especially considering Christianity would be completely disproven by Egyptian belief. They bring the mummy back to life, but she immediately kills them all, so we learn absolutely nothing about ancient Egypt. There is an alternate version of the story where they fail to bring the mummy to life and everyone just lives happily ever after, but that's a lot less fun, isn't it? Stoker was writing this story against popular belief at the time. While the Industrial Revolution had everybody else look into the future, Stoker suggested that we not forget the past and the lessons that it has to teach us. It's a story that he only could have published as a Gothic novel at the time, considering how horrifying its implications would have been to a Christian audience. But it is one that pays respect to the history insofar as he could. I'm not saying that it, stopped people from grinding up mummies for fun or whatever, but I do appreciate that it encourages people to learn about the past rather than set it on fire. And famed horror writer Edgar Allan Poe gave us one of the funniest early examples of a mummy in his 1845 short story, Some Words with a Mummy. A group of men get together to watch a mummy being unwrapped, but the mummy comes to life and scares the bejesus out of them. But it's okay, because this mummy is a good mummy. The mummy introduces himself by the name of Almastakio, and they all sit down to have a nice chat about whose culture is better, 19th century America or ancient Egypt. Almastakio makes some good points, saying that ancient Egyptians used to live for thousands of years and that they didn't die, but rather entered into a state of sleep from which they could be awoken at any moment. The men ask Almastakio if they had either the manufacture of Ponenner's lozenges or Brandeth's pills in ancient Egypt. And Almastakio has to admit that they didn't, so America wins. Still, the narrator decides that he may not be happy with his life circumstances after all in the end, and he decides to get himself embalmed for a few years. As you can already see, another big fear from these early mummy stories was that the past may have been a better time than the present. The world was changing rather quickly in the Victorian period, and it made a lot of people pretty nostalgic for the old ways. But these stories were also pretty heavily rooted in their own time period. If mummies were going to become timeless, we were going to need something else to inspire them. Now, there were plenty of stories that inspired stories of mummies, but most of the time they'd show up when someone unearthed a pharaoh. The Jewel of Seven Stars was published the same year that Howard Carter came across the tomb of Pharaoh Hatshepsut, and Bram Stoker borrowed several details from her real life when he was writing his fictional mummy, Queen Tara. Arthur Conan Doyle was most likely inspired by the discovery of Pharaoh Ramses II in the early 1880s. But when it comes to our modern mummy horror stories, most of those can be traced back to one fairly unimportant pharaoh. Tutankhamun ruled for a short time in the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt, and he was only about 18 or 19 when he died. We don't entirely know how he died.
How'd you get so funky?
We believe him to have been the son of the extremely controversial Pharaoh Akhenaten, who was hated by the Egyptian public for enforcing a religion based around a single deity. So between that and the results of certain X-ray analysis on his remains, some people believe he may have been murdered for political gain. But at the same time, his health was pretty poor at the time of his death. Tutankhamun suffered from bone necrosis, scoliosis, and he had a club foot. He had also contracted several strains of malaria at the time of his death, so many experts believe that he probably died from a broken leg that was made worse by the malaria. The murder thing isn't necessarily for sure, is what I'm saying. What we do know is that Kin Tut was buried in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kins, which, again, seems strange for someone of such a high status. Not especially strange, maybe he just died too suddenly and there wasn't enough time to prepare a proper tomb for him. Tutankhamun's tomb had also been disturbed before it was uncovered by British archaeologist Howard Carter in 1922. Things like perishable oils and perfumes were missing, and there were signs that the tomb had been restored after the thefts. And in the coming months, several of the men who had entered the tomb would be dead, leading to the belief that the young pharaoh's tomb had been cursed. No curse was ever actually found written in hieroglyphics on the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb. But it is strange how many people either got sick or incredibly unlucky after the trip. The team's financial backer had a mosquito bite become infected, leading to blood poisoning. And Howard Carter gave relics from the tomb to a friend, only to have his house burned down shortly afterwards. Several of the men suffered from fever and other symptoms after the trip, something that scientists chalk up to fungus or poisonous gases hidden in the tomb. See, there is some reason to be wary of ancient resting places, it just might not be a mummy's curse. It's hard to say if we even would have thought the tomb was cursed if horror stories hadn't been drilling the idea into our heads for decades. But everything about this story just seemed to align so well with the fantasy that it felt like the horror stories were coming to life. Mummies had been falling out of fashion in the last few years, but all of a sudden everyone wanted to know more about them, and you could really see that reflected on the big screen. If you're a fan of the Brendan Fraser movie, this is where it all begins. The Mummy joined Universal's roster of movie monsters in the oh-so-creatively named 1932 film, The Mummy. Producer Carl Laemmle Jr. was mostly inspired by the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb a decade prior when he asked writer Richard Schayer to find a novel they could base their movie off of. But Richard couldn't find anything that suited what they were looking for. There are some similarities to Arthur Conan Doyle's The Ring of Thoth, but it's far from a direct adaptation and more inspired by. 1932's The Mummy starts out with an expedition that definitely would have brought to mind the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, except this expedition leads to the discovery of the mummy of an ancient Egyptian priest named Imhotep. They find signs that poor Imhotep was actually mummified alive as punishment, something that never actually happened in ancient Egypt, by the way. To be mummified was considered a great honor. It was the only chance you'd have to enjoy a smooth afterlife. To be mummified as a punishment would be like receiving the world's most painful long-term gift. Like, yeah, it would suck, but I'd be willing to go through some discomfort just so my body would be able to return to my soul whenever I want. I already have tattoos, how much worse can it be? Yeah, my brain is not wired like other people's. One of the men on the expedition reads from the fictional Scroll of Thoth, which brings Imhotep back to life. Imhotep rejoins society and begins to pass as an Egyptian historian for several years, up until the day he meets a half-Egyptian woman who he believes to be the reincarnation of his long-lost love, Princess Ankhesenamun. He kidnaps the woman and tries to resurrect his lover through her, but at the last moment, a statue of the goddess Isis comes to life to defend her.
Oh, Isis, holy maiden, I was thy consecrated vestal. Teach me the ancient summons, the holy spells I've forgotten.
Our heroine gets away, and Christianity is entirely disproven. That's it, people. Go home. The goddess Isis is coming to life and owning mummies. What has your god been doing for you lately?
What have you done for me lately?
Obviously, I'm joking, but I do find it funny how this movie has absolutely no care for the traditions of conservative media. The Mummy was made before the Hays Code was enforced, and you gotta know that it would have turned out differently if it had been made after. We would have gotten like the Virgin Mary riding in from the heavens on the Lion of Judah or something. Which actually is something I would pay to see. Princess Ankhesenamun was named after the wife of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, whose remains have never actually been found, although images of her had been found on the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb. Makeup artist Jack Pierce, whose name you may recognize if you've seen my Frankenstein video, studied pictures of Seti I's mummy for Imhotep's design. Boris Karloff had to be wrapped up in bandages that had to be treated with acid and burned in an oven. He had spirit gum, cotton, and collodion applied to his face and clay added to his hair. It took about 8 hours every day for them to complete his mummy makeup look, and Boris Karloff found the removal process to be so painful he called it the most trying ordeal I had ever endured. Still, the movie was a huge success and it spawned several immediate sequels. none of which we're going to be talking about today. Instead, I want to bring you to the next point in time when mummies would hit it big in Hollywood. That's right, it took almost 7 decades for the next big mummy movie to be made. Now, to be fair, producers James Jacks and Sean Daniel had been planning on rebooting this property for Universal Studios as early as the 1980s, when they'd been granted around $10 million to turn it into a low-budget horror franchise. George A. Romero was the first director attached to the project back in 1987, but when he backed out, they'd eventually go through directors such as Clive Barker, Joe Dante, and Wes Craven, all of whom would eventually back out, but for some reason, the studio became convinced during all this that the movie deserved a higher budget. Enter Stephen Sommers, who had a slightly different vision for the movie. He directed it as more of an action comedy, which was definitely a smart idea for the time. Low-budget horror movies may have been doing well in 1987, but by the late 90s, overly long, drawn-out action flicks had become the guilty pleasure of choice. I'm sorry, I know everyone has their trash, and Lord knows my trash isn't for everyone. But personally, I just have a hard time with action movies from this era. I see it all as just pointless action scenes padded out with exposition. And in my opinion, 1999's The Mummy is no different. I adored this movie as a kid. Princess Tutankhamun was literally a sexual awakening for me, and to this day, I'll still admit that the costumes and sets are all beautifully done. They filmed most of this movie in the deserts of Morocco, and they truly are gorgeous to look at, even if the CGI is a little bit dated. But it was 1999, so what you gonna do? But anyway, what's this movie about? Like the 1932 movie, we're following a group on an expedition through Egypt, although this time they're searching for the lost city of Hamunaptra, which isn't a real lost city, but it was smart for the writers to have our group exploring a mystery rather than straight out hunting for mummies, since this movie wasn't necessarily responding to any particular discovery at the time. Another big difference is that our half-Egyptian woman actually gets to join the expedition this time. Rachel Weisz is a breath of fresh air in this movie. She's just adorable. Oops. Although her function in this story isn't quite as clear as it was in the first movie, after she raises Imhotep from the dead by reading aloud from a book in perfect ancient Egyptian, even though she's been translating everything else into English up to that point.
And he left a message. Death is only the beginning.
What's it say?
Amun-Ra, Amun-Day.
I'm sorry, but that was a stupid moment. Imhotep becomes obsessed with kidnapping her so that he can use her to resurrect his dead girlfriend, Tutankhamun. But she isn't supposed to be, like, his girlfriend's reincarnation or anything. I thought they might be going there when they had her bring up being half Egyptian and everything.
He loved Egypt so much. He married my mother, who was an Egyptian.
But no. So then, like, any random woman would work for this ritual, and Imhotep is really going out of his way for Rachel Weisz for some reason? I'm not sure the writers even spoke to each other when they were working on this script. Imhotep makes no attempt to rejoin society like he does in the original movie. Instead, his resurrection brings about a world-ending curse that unleashes the 7 plagues upon Egypt.
Taste it. It's just like blood.
Were they just doing shots of water? Imhotep terrorizes our heroes for a while by turning into Anakin repellent.
I don't like sand.
But eventually they defeat him without the help of any Egyptian goddesses, and they all live boringly ever after. This movie is worse than ever for that whole historical inaccuracy thing. Not only do they double down on the made-up idea that mummification was used as a punishment in Egypt, but for some reason, they also seem to think that scarabs burrow under your skin and eat your flesh. Yeah, that's not a thing. I mean, there are flesh-eating beetles found all across North America, sure, but they tend to eat the flesh of dead things, not, like, living humans. I know that this movie isn't meant to be a documentary on ancient Egypt, but it does bother me when a high-budget movie intentionally changes historical details just so they can make another culture look scarier. And I love Brendan Fraser as much as the next guy, but this is not one of his better roles.
Then get me the hell out of here!
So, sexually assaulting women gets you what you want from them? Cool. Great lesson, movie. But like I said, the movie's gorgeous. If you can shut off your brain and just let the visuals wash over you for a bit, you'll definitely find something to enjoy here. So is it any surprise that The Mummy was given a sequel? Okay, so I know that I skipped over all the sequels to the 32 movie, so giving this one its own entry does feel a little unfair. I'm sorry, I just had way too much to say about this one. I remember watching The Mummy Returns more than the first movie when I was a kid. That isn't to say it's a better movie by any means, I think it just goes to show that I've always been a simp for badass women. The actual reincarnation of Anck-su-namun appears in this movie, played by her original actress, Patricia Vasquez. I'm not sure that's how reincarnation works, like you just look exactly the same as you did in your last life when you lived in a different country and were born to a different family, but okay. So if I got reincarnated into like a cat or something, would it be like a cat with my exact face? Because that's disturbing. But anyway, the reincarnation of Anck-su-namun apparently has no stakes in her own life. She's dedicated herself to resurrecting her dead boyfriend so that he can kill her and bring back Anck-su-namun. And the rest of the movie is dedicated to them trying to kill the Scorpion King so that they can gain command over Anubis's army.
The Scorpion King made a pact with the dark god Anubis.
Can we please stop calling every Egyptian deity the dark god? We get it, movie. You're racist. Move on. Part of summoning the Scorpion King involves kidnapping Rachel Weisz and her fictional movie son. So Brendan Fraser teams up with the tattoo guy from the first movie to get his family back.
If I were to say to you, I'm a stranger traveling from the east seeking that which is lost.
And I would reply that I am a stranger traveling from the west, as I whom you seek.
Did we just become best friends? Yup!
Hey man, how's it going? I'm a snake. Whoa, hey, what am I gonna do? Bite the first person I'm thrown at? I'm getting the hell out of here. Costume designer John Bloomfield truly did an excellent job on this entire movie. Little details like the way that Patricia Vasquez's sleeves mimic Anck-su-namun's body paint from the first movie are just too good. But it is a little disappointing to me that Imhotep seems to have all these sweet mummy powers and she's always just surprised to find out her boyfriend's a waterbender. Why didn't she get any cool superpowers with the resurrection? Hey, you guys try waking up from a 1,000-year-old nap. My entire body's cramped. Fun fact, this was actually the first time I'd ever seen Dwayne Johnson in a movie, and it took me years to come to terms with the fact that his face didn't actually look like a horrifying cartoons. Seriously, when our villains actually get around to summoning the Scorpion King, he's even lamer looking than the pudgy dad-looking dude they have playing Imhotep in these movies. No! Can we please make that a meme? Like, me when my friends put themselves down. No! Me when Burger King says there's no more chicky nuggies. No! But in the end, the pyramid is destroyed and our villain couple don't even stick together. Why are villain ladies always running away at the last second and making their boyfriends cry? Why can't villain partners just be together on this? Seriously, Imhotep may be the least threatening movie monster I've ever seen. The Scorpion King would get his own prequel movie in 2002. But let's step away from the whole Egypt thing for a little bit. What other kind of stories might we be able to label a mummy movie? This one may be a mummy movie more in name, seeing as there aren't any actual mummies in it. The third movie in the franchise was released 7 years after The Mummy Returns, and by that point it felt like most audiences had kinda moved on. They clearly tried to refresh the franchise by bringing us to a new setting. And again, this movie is gorgeous. Much of the movie was actually filmed on location in China, although it does feel weird to not have Rachel Weisz here at all. Instead, we have Maria Bello recast as her character, and it is super jarring. But what is the plot to this thing? Well, our villain this time around is an ancient Chinese emperor who was cursed along with his soldiers to live forever as the Terracotta Army, and they're eventually brought to life using mystical water from Shangri-La. The Terracotta Army, by the way, is a real-life form of funerary art that was buried with the Chinese emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, in order to protect him in the afterlife. Qin Shi Huang did, in fact, build a precursor to the Great Wall of China, although this movie credits its Emperor Han for the whole thing. Later on in life, he did actually seek the elixir of life. And when he died, his men continued to treat him as though he were alive by changing his clothes daily, providing him with food, and continuing to carry messages from him. So yeah, it is a bit of a freaky story, but it doesn't have anything to do with mummies. You can see similarities to traditional mummy stories, but it's sort of like just boiling them down to the basics. We have the leader of some sort of non-white country who discovers the secret to some sort of cursed immortality. And somehow ancient relics have to get involved. So to some degree, if you were to ask me what the difference between a mummy and a zombie is, I might point you to this movie. Mummies are intelligent. They're dignified because they were always some sort of leader in their life. And not only that, but they're always connected to some sort of ancient past that white people consider foreign and mysterious. There's always a curse involved, whereas zombies are more often connected to the idea of the masses, conformity, and disease. Both mummies and zombies may be reanimated dead people, but zombies are more likely to be the ones taking orders from mummies. And then Frankensteins are like the lone wolves that nobody likes. I don't know, I'm having fun here. But the fact that mummies have always been such a racialized threat does sort of make them feel uncomfortable in this day and age. Every single one of these stories has dealt with some sort of racialized individual fighting against our white protagonists. And in every single case, except for maybe a couple of the older ones, that racialized threat is defeated without any attempt at communication between the two parties. I know these stories wouldn't be very scary if there were, but at the very least, our Victorian writers were trying to fight against an atrocity that was actively happening in the dominant culture at the time. The further away we get from being a culture that unravels mummies for fun, the less reason we have to tell these stories. Mummies are just sort of a thing you see in museums sometimes, unless you're working as an archaeologist, in which case that is so cool, please trade lives with me. The Mummy Tomb of the Dragon Emperor may have killed the Brendan Fraser franchise in Hollywood, but that wasn't the last time that we'd be seeing a mummy movie from Universal Studios. Okay, let's get one uncomfortable thing out of the way here. I kind of hate Tom Cruise. Yeah, I know he's talented. He did a great job in Interview with the Vampire. Who knew he'd be so great at playing a rich bitch who uses people for his own means? Oh, wait. And yes, I've read about how he does all his own stunts. He's almost died on a few movie sets, and even for this movie, he had to do 64 different takes in zero gravity for the plane crash scene. It must be really scary to base your entire career off of making ridiculous amounts of money by setting a bad precedence for actors who don't want to risk their health and safety for a job, especially when not all movie sets have the same protective measures put in place as a Hollywood production is obviously going to arrange for Tom Cruise. If Tom Cruise dies on a movie set, the studio gets their faces sewed off. If some young nobody gets hurt because they want it to be Tom Cruise, that's a footnote in TMZ's reporting week. Normally, I wouldn't be bringing any of this up because it isn't relevant. Except Tom Cruise was given just way too much control over pretty much every aspect of this movie. To the point that supervising art director Frank Walsh said, "This is very much a movie of two halves, before Tom and after Tom." I can just picture the writers at Universal wanting to make a reboot to the Mummy movie, and then Tom Cruise walks in and he's all like, "It needs more me." But don't take my word for it. I doubt very many of you watched this thing, and if you did, you definitely walked out early, so let's get the plot description over with. Tom is playing a soldier in Iraq who stumbles across the buried tomb of an ancient Egyptian princess named Amenet. What she was doing buried in Iraq is anyone's guess, but okay. Now, I was hoping to be able to avoid this for as long as I could, but I was gonna have to bring it up eventually. This is the first Mummy movie made after 9/11. This makes the fact that our heroes are American soldiers a little interesting, let's say. It definitely feels like the movie went out of its way to bring up those references by opening with the war in Iraq as well, which definitely ups the discomfort factor a little bit. There was literally no reason to bring these things up for a mummy movie, but anyway. Tom recruits his archaeologist girlfriend to go into the tomb, and they just start stomping around right away. They come across Amenet's suspended sarcophagus and decide to take it home. Amenet, by the way, was a princess who sought the throne and sold her soul to the god Set in order to get it. It does seem a little silly for her to go that far, considering women could be pharaohs in ancient Egypt. The role of women in ancient Egypt was kind of complicated to get into, and it's still under some pretty heavy debate within academia to this day. But that being said, women did tend to have more freedoms there than we tend to think of nowadays. There were even some pharaohs, like Akhenaten, who chose to rule alongside his wife Nefertiti, a woman who was worshipped as a live-in fertility goddess by the Egyptian people during her lifetime. But let's go back to talking about the god Set for a minute. This movie very clearly personifies Set as a demon, which was actually a pretty common thing for non-Egyptians to do as far back as the 3rd intermediate and late period. Set was the god of foreigners, and so over time, he came to be associated with foreign oppressors like the Kushite and Persian empires. But even then, there were still many Egyptians who considered Set to be an important and heroic deity. So there is some historical context for this, but it still kind of feels like they just picked out the first scary-sounding Egyptian deity they could find without any historical research. When the princess was found out, she was punished by being mummified alive, although in this case I'm choosing to believe that the narrator's just stupid, and they actually mummified her to honor the vessel chosen by the god Set because that's actually more historically accurate than what they came up with. It still wouldn't have happened this way, but give me something, okay? Tom Cruise takes Amenet's sarcophagus back to the Americas when Tom begins receiving visions of Amenet trying to mac on him. The plane crashes and Amenet comes to life, with nothing to trigger it, really. But of course, nothing can kill Tom. Yep, we get it, Tom. You're cool. This entire movie feels like Tom Cruise bragging about how he's so hot that even ancient Egyptian pharaohs want him. But he's just too good even for them. Humble yourself, Tom. You weren't good enough for Nicole Kidman or Katie Holmes. What makes you think Hatshepsut's giving you the time of day? And yes, I am aware that this movie is partially inspired by the Jewel of the Seven Stars, which also had a female mummy haunting a man in his dreams. But there, it felt more like she was taking full advantage of him, and not like she actually wanted to rule as Set's king and queen like she does in this movie. But I think the moment that really had everyone scratching their heads in confusion is when we meet Russell Crowe as Dr. Jekyll. Let me explain. Universal Studios at the time had been planning on building an entire dark universe that would bring together all of their old monster movies in this big MCU-style team-up. Plenty of the cast had already been announced too, with actors like Johnny Depp in the role of the Invisible Man and Angelina Jolie playing the Bride of Frankenstein. But the whole thing wound up being cancelled after the Mummy bombed so hard. Dr. Jekyll here appears as the owner of a collection of ancient relics brought over to England during the Crusades. You'd think it would have made more sense for him to have built up this collection during the Victorian period, since this is, you know, a mummy movie, and that was when rich English people were really building up their Egyptian collections more than ever. But I'm already pretty sure that I did more research for this video than anyone ever thought to do over the entire production period for this movie. Dr. Jekyll tortures Amenet, but that makes Tom sad because he's still possessed by her, and she manipulates Tom into setting her free so that she can try to mac on him again. But being her kin just sounds far too much like commitment to Tom. He kills Amenet and becomes a mummy himself in the process, but Dr. Jekyll promises to resurrect him at the end because...
sometimes it does take a monster to fight a monster.
So what you're saying, movie, is that the only way that we as Americans can stand up against a sexy, racialized, feminine threat from the Middle East is by banding behind straight white egomaniacs like Tom Cruise. Great message. Man, am I glad this movie didn't get a sequel. Honestly, I think that mummy horror stories at this point work best if you just leave them as B-movies. Bubba Ho-Tep is a B-movie classic, and believe it or not, it actually has something to say. Bruce Campbell stars as an elderly Elvis Presley, who claims to have switched places with an Elvis impersonator at some point in his career so that he could live out the rest of his life in peace. Now he's living out of a retirement home with a man named Jack, who claims to be President John F. Kennedy. But he had his skin dyed black after an assassination attempt, and he was left here by Lyndon Johnson. Eventually, the two of them realize that an Egyptian mummy stolen from a museum has come to life and begun feasting on the souls of the old people at the nursing nursing home. But because nobody believes them, it's up to them to take down the mummy on their motorized wheelchair and walker. Both of our heroes end up dying in the fight, but the movie ends with Bruce Campbell's Elvis coming to accept death.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
This script is far too good for this budget. I love how our protagonists almost serve as mummies themselves. They're the empty husks of once great heroes, both of whom have already lived through their recorded deaths and yet still linger around with no real drive or purpose left to them anymore. They aren't even believed to be who they really are because everyone is convinced that they know the story already. But when you really think about it, how much do we really know about Elvis as a person, let alone Pharaoh Hatshepsut? There's also a heavy theme of nostalgia in this movie, a fear that things may have been better in the past that we haven't really seen in any mummy story since the Jewel of 7 Stars. But in the end, it's important that our heroes learn to accept death gracefully, especially since that's the thing that everyone's been fighting against this whole time. Few of these stories really dwell on the idea that ancient Egyptians were trying to create a form of immortality with mummification, and that maybe that might have been a bad thing. We've seen people try to uncover the secret to their immortality so that they can use it for themselves, like in the Edgar Allan Poe story. But Bubba Ho-Tep suggests that living forever kinda sucks, because eventually you're gonna get to the point where you're just run down and tired of everything. Maybe it's better to just take a graceful bow and step off the stage when your time has come. That's surprisingly heavy for a movie with jokes like this. But let's lighten the mood a little bit. Have you guys heard of Robot versus the Aztec Mummy? It's the face-off that nobody asked for. The Aztec Mummy trilogy is a series of Mexican horror movies filmed consecutively in 1957. I only watched the third movie, The Robot vs. the Aztec Mummy, but since that movie mostly consists of flashbacks to the prior films anyway, I think I got the gist. The first movie is very inspired by the plot to the 1932 movie, except there's a lot more focus on the whole reincarnation thing. And by that I mean that our main character is a scientist who practices hypnosis to help people remember their past lives. When he does this for one woman, it leads them to the remains of an ancient Aztec mummy. And before you ask, yes, the Aztecs did practice a form of mummification, but Aztec mummies don't look the way they do in this movie. While Egyptian mummies were laid out supine, which made them perfect for imagining that they could just get up and walk around, Aztec mummies were posed in a seated position which was held in place with a cloth wrapping. Talk about waking up stiff. It was probably for a similar reason that Tomb of the Dragon Emperor didn't give us a Soku Shinbutsu, even though it probably would have been the most obvious route for them to take. The Terracotta Army? Really? What does that have to do with mummies? A lot of mummies are posed in these sort of horrifying or unnatural positions, to be honest, which is part of the reason why Egyptian mummies lend themselves so well to this medium. They just look a lot more lifelike. In fact, in the Victorian period, Egyptian mummies were thought to look so lifelike that female mummies would often be eroticized, because of course they were. We can't let women rest even in death, can we? But our heroes aren't the only ones raiding the Aztec mummy's tomb in this movie. A villain known as the Bat has his heart set on stealing the mummy's treasure, but the mummy wakes up before he can make away with it. The Bat decides that the best way to solve this problem is by building what he calls a human robot to fight the mummy.
A human robot, Doctor!
By human robot, by the way, what he means is a robot with a human head. So wouldn't that technically make it a cyborg, or...
A human robot, Doctor!
The robot and mummy fight, and I don't know why I thought it would be interesting. I thought the robot might have some lasers, or the mummy might have some cool curse powers or something, but no, they're just hugging. Eventually our heroes just tell the mummy to go home, and he does. No real threat, he just wanted to be left alone like Bilbo Baggins. This movie's ridiculous, but I do like the way that it highlights what is perhaps the most important lesson we can take away from these stories. That ancient relics really just want to be left alone. I also appreciate that there's no foreign threat in this movie. The conflict in this movie comes more from the idea of how we're dealing with our own past in the present. Which just goes to prove my theory that you could tell a good mummy story these days, it would just need to come from a writer with the right perspective. I'm not saying that person is me, by the way. I'm just saying that someone could do it. I'm working on a story about aliens right now. But whoever that person is, it definitely isn't Disney. I find it funny how many different ways we keep finding to make The Mummy the symbol of nostalgia. Under Wraps is a Disney Channel original movie that was first released back in 1997, but it went on to receive a remake in 2021 and a sequel to that remake in 2022. All of these movies hit more or less the same plot beats. A group of children come across an awakened mummy and they need to enlist the help of a monster-obsessed friend to get the mummy back to the museum where his girlfriend's being kept before the thieves who stole him in the first place can get to him. Think Home Alone if the thing we were protecting was an ancient Egyptian mummy named Harold instead of a house. You can see a lot of influence from the Rin of Thoth too, and it's funny how easy it is to turn that into a child-friendly plot. But I guess the thing I wanted to focus on most for this movie was the way that mummies have now come to represent a different past than the one of ancient Egypt. The nostalgia in Under Wraps is not for some long-gone, highly advanced civilization, but for the days of old black and white monster movies, which I'm sure, in a day and age where torture porn exists, looks really innocent to a company like Disney. Our main kid has an obsession with monster movies, and he uses that to help them wrangle Harold. You have the theme that ancient relics belong in a museum, which tends to be the strongest takeaway from these stories anyway. The mummy isn't so much of a threat as he is, like, a pet. I wouldn't even call him a friend. He's so grunting and caveman-like that it's almost entirely separated from anything ancient Egypt. We might as well be watching Encino Man for all the difference it would make. The thieves are clearly the bad guys in this movie, which is how it probably should be anyway. If you're one of those people who can't stand decoms, then this mummy movie obviously isn't for you, but otherwise you might find something to enjoy here. So we started this video off with a question. Why don't we see as many mummy movies anymore? Part of that is the fact that mummies just aren't as relevant to our lives as they used to be. But the other part of that is that you can't really make a mummy movie that's middling anymore. You need to be very careful to balance the politics, the history, and everything else that goes into making a monster movie. I expected when I started this video that the Brendan Fraser movies were probably gonna be the best, and that the further back in time I went, the cringier these stories were gonna get. And yet I found almost the opposite. The closer back in time we go to the moment in history that inspired the telling of these stories, the more these stories had to say. To the point that it really feels like we're beating a dead horse with the genre past the 1950s. I'm not saying you couldn't make a good mummy story, I'm just saying that there's a lot more history involved now. Do you have any recommendations for good mummy stories for me? If I find something that interests me, I might do a shorter spin-off video on that later, and you could definitely be a huge help for me in that. Thank you for joining me, my friends, and remember, you have less to fear from a mummy than you do from your everyday grave robber. Pleasant dreams.
I am proud of what I am.
And what is that?
Special thanks to my supporters on Patreon, Wilson Elrix III and Ericobia. If you'd like to become a part of our little monster squad, just know that everybody's welcome. Hitting that subscribe button is a surefire way to become a member, but the Patreon link is there in the video description if you'd like to receive some bonus perks along the way. Things like early access to videos and scripts, and your name called out at the end. Until next time, my friends.
I am a librarian.